So, good afternoon and a very warm welcome, not to a policy dialogue, but to EPC Update, this post-summit briefing and EPC Update, where we take our regular look at developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, are Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, and we're delighted to welcome our special guest, she's back, Almut Möller, Director. Almut, I have lost your title. It has disappeared from my screen.
Director for EU and Global Affairs.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I don't know what
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Almut. And we're going to assess the results we've had. Let's put it this way, it's an understatement perhaps to say it's been a momentous week for the world. We're going to look at the results of last week's informal EU summit. We're going to consider the consequences of Donald Trump's resounding victory in the US elections. And we're also going to examine the collapse of the German government, what happens next, and what does it mean for Europe. So a lot to get through. As always, totally interactive. If you have a question, you can either write it in the Q&A box, brief please, not essays, or you can click on the raised hands button and I will give you the mic when the time comes. Let us start. We have to start, I think, with the political earthquake that was the resounding victory for Donald Trump in the United States presidential election. So I think we need to start really, there is nowhere else we can start, Janis, but there. In terms of the response from Europe, I mean, EU leaders were meeting anyway. They discussed the result overnight at dinner on the Thursday. What do you read into the tone of those initial reactions and whether we have a sense already of how the EU, does it have a strategy? We've talked on previous updates about preparing for this possibility. Does it have a plan, a strategy for how it's going to respond?
Well, first of all, I think it was in everyone's mind already at the meeting of the European Political Community, which also took place, the summit on the Thursday, at the dinner the following day, and it has remained in the minds of people. So it is something which clearly everyone is aware has a huge effect. But when it comes to the question as to whether everyone's on the same page, well, obviously not. Listen just to what the reaction of Viktor Orban was to the victory of Donald Trump, who is victorious himself, in a sense saying, see, I told you so. This is my guy who won. And I was right, and I will continue to be right. Others being extremely worried about what it might mean. Others saying, we have a working relationship, we know each other, we will try to connect to him. So the immediate reaction to what has happened in the US, what the US election mean, is different from each other. And also in terms of the more substance-related issue, we will be talking about it. Also when we talk about competitiveness, but also in other policy areas, and especially when it comes to Ukraine, there are different opinions which diverge among the EU 27, thus also among the leaders within member states. So there's not one approach defined on how to react to it. What now is the attempt is to try to connect to him. We see that leaders are trying to have phone calls with him in order to have a first exchange. That's probably also what they're being paid for, in order to make sure that the worst of potential outcomes of Trump assuming office in January, but de facto he's already pretending he's the 47th president. So he's already started now. So the approach is, we approach him, we try to make sure that we can affect his thinking and try to avoid the worst. And others saying, let's hope that he will deliver and make Europe great again in a different way by changing from within.
Fabian, is your sense that, as Janis says, this attempt at the moment to try and connect and so on, but is your sense that behind the scenes, at least, serious preparation had been made for this moment, for the challenges it poses? And I was very struck by a big difference between something Charles Michel said and something Viktor Orban said after the summit. Charles Michel said after the summit, quotes, "All of us agree that the challenges we faced yesterday are no different today." And you contrast this with Orban, who said, "History is accelerated. The world is going to change and change in a quicker way than ever before." I mean, who is right? Is this a second Zeitenwende on top of that sparked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Are the challenges the same today as they were yesterday? I mean, it seems to me things have changed dramatically. What's your reading?
I think that in this particular instance, unfortunately, Viktor Orban is right. It is a fundamental change to the way the world is operating. It is a Zeitenwende. And in particular, it's a fundamental challenge for Europe. Donald Trump is a direct threat to Europe's prosperity, to Europe's sustainability, to our security, and to our democracy. Now, the sentiment of Viktor Orban, of course, is very different, because what he's talking about is that this is the solution to Europe's problems. He sees this as the path towards illiberal democracy, towards a world which is much more nativist, anti-migrant, all the things we know about Trump, and that the Trump 2 administration is going to deliver all that. So it's going to be Trump 1 on steroids.
I mean, Almut, one of the things, we'll come to the issue of competitiveness and the discussion on that at the summit in a moment, but one of the quotes I would draw from the declaration that emerged from that summit was, "We seize the wake-up call." There they were referring to the Draghi and Letta reports. We'll come on to that. But in a broader sense, do you think EU leaders will seize this wake-up call? Is your sense that they are better prepared than they might seem in public? What's your reading of where we are now as Janis says, Donald Trump begins to put together his administration, begins to make big announcements about what he's going to do, which seem pretty much in line with what he said he'd do?
I think there is an understanding of the next US president that is deeper compared to his first presidency, which gives a pretty clear idea about a president who is likely to be very erratic, and that makes it particularly difficult to develop strategy, to go back to the first question you put to Janis, Jacki. And I think this will be very challenging, because the Union, in many ways, I mean, we've had a routine and rituals of collaboration over the pond for many decades. But now there has been less and less reliability over the years. And this is going to dramatically amplify with Donald Trump too. And so in order to be able to deal, and I sign up to everything that Janis and Fabian said, but I think in terms of how to conduct policies and how to prepare, this element of chaotic things that are likely to emanate from the White House and might change from one day to the next here and there will make it tremendously difficult to prepare, to react. And has Europe understood the wake-up call? My sense is the contours have already been visible. If you look at Commission President von der Leyen's way of talking in the European Parliament on other occasions, of course, diplomatically speaking, this is not a direct attack on the next president of the United States. This is not what member states leaders could do at this point in time, understandably so. But the language that says that we really need to focus now on getting our house in order carries that urgency. I think from a kind of level of understanding the problem, this is not the issue, but the political majorities behind what needs to be done, this is something I have a huge question mark.
And is your sense, just to follow up on that, Almut, that in terms of protecting the EU protecting itself from that unpredictability to the degree that it can, is it for you more a sense of we need to stick to our guns on the things that matter to us? We can't be, going this way and that in an attempt to appease Donald Trump or an attempt to give him some trade-offs, because we know he's very much a deal maker. Do you think the approach is going to have to be very ad hoc, or can there be a sort of consistent strategy despite the chaos? What way do you think they will go?
From a political perspective, you have to deal with the world as it is, not as the world you would think and love it to be. So there is always an element of unpredictability. What is new is that amongst reliable partners and in very key areas, in particular on European security, there's also a great deal of dependency to have to deal with such unpredictability. And for the union of 27 members, this is more difficult than to organize. But a union that wants to succeed in the world to come absolutely needs to be able to embrace flexibility and has to organize it in its institutional and procedural setups, because the world is changing dramatically. If we are static, we will not succeed. But that is a different level of ambition and a different level of challenge that EU leaders are facing now. And the fire is coming from a place that used to be a lot more friendly. So that I would place as the context.
Janis and Fabian, you both wanted to come in. Janis first.
I think I'm not sure that we are fully understanding what the election of Trump means or potentially can mean. Let me mention a couple of reasons. One is, this is not 2016. He's had a huge victory. He has the popular vote in behind him. He has a majority in Congress. He has the Supreme Court on his side. So that in itself already means it's a different situation. But also on our side, we are at a different moment. If you look into the rise of popular forces, of those who are supportive of Trump's or the Trumpist ideology, are much stronger in the EU. He will try to divide us. He will attempt his best to divide us, and he will have those within the EU who will help us to divide us, who have a different idea of the EU of the future in their mind, and they will try to use the fact that he's in power in the White House. So that in itself makes a huge difference. But then we have a lot of focus on what will he potentially do, and we should assume that he will do what he promised he would do. What are the issues which will mostly affect us? So we look into Ukraine, obvious. We look into tariffs, obvious. We look into what it might mean for the Middle East. And for all these things, the fact that he will enter power in January is bad news from a European perspective. But I think what we need to think much more about is what it means for the internal democratic or non-democratic developments in the US and the repercussion that has on us. Because if he actually tries to change the system from within and puts in place people who will help him to change the system from within and are committed to doing that, ideologically and practically are ready to do so. And when you see the first people who he's nominating, you see that he's nominating those people. So if he tries to change the US from within, tries to have a system change, that has effects on us which are much more profound than all the different things which we're now being discussing. And I'm trying to say that what I think we are aware of, that this is really bad news from the perspective of many, not from the perspective of everyone, by the way, in the EU, but from the perspective of many. But I'm not sure that we are fully aware of the potential effect it could have on us, also because of the internal developments in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. Take the point. Fabian, and if I could add to this, I just wanted to make reference before you react to what's been said, to a commentary that three of you all wrote together after Trump's victory, entitled "Overcoming a Hollow and Illusory Unity, Preparing Europe for Trump." And you warned in there, you said pro-Europeans should not sacrifice ambition for a hollow and illusory unity among all member states, saying this could have severe consequences. And I wonder if you could just elaborate, what would the consequences be if we pretend unity where there is none, and how feasible is the alternative that you're proposing, which is that finally we have to go seriously down this route of differentiated integration?
Well, firstly, to react, I think it's important to emphasize that Trump itself, when it comes to policies, is not unpredictable. We know what he intends to do. He has said it many, many times. Now, we don't know exactly how they are going to work. We don't know exactly the consequences, but we should be in no doubt about the direction of travel. And that also means that we could prepare more, that we could do more, because we know there are certain demands which are going to be on the table. So just to give one example, how is Europe going to react to the demand which is going to come, that Europe will have to finance its own defense and security to a much higher degree than we have done up to now? Are we going to increase our spending? To what extent? How is that going to work between different countries? These are things we already know. And in all of these areas, we should look at worst case scenarios, because most likely that's exactly what's going to happen. Now, when it comes to what we have proposed, that's really exactly applying that kind of concept to the way integration works in the European Union. We know that there are severe differences between the member states on a number of key issues where progress is necessary. Now, we can either try to go ahead with this supra-governmental avant-garde we have been talking about, so that we can make progress. It is not ideal. It has a lot of difficulties associated with it. But the alternative is that we don't move at all, that we continue to pretend that we all agree with each other, even though that is patently not the case. And we don't do the things which are necessary to do. So this is really the world we're living in. Either we are going to have to make some hard choices, which are unpalatable in many different ways, or we're not going to react in an even adequate way to what is happening, which will just put us in a worse and worse position as time goes on.
Mm. And is your sense that those hard choices are being faced? Or do you still fear that despite this "we have woken up" message from Budapest, actually, no, they haven't?
I would say absolutely not. We are still continuing down the route of essentially not wanting to see what is happening around us. Because it is very, very difficult also for politicians to communicate this to electorates, that we are in a radically different world than the one we were in. And that world is not better for us. It has significantly deteriorated in many different areas. And that's not an easy message to give to people. But I think this is exactly what we need to do, because people need to understand the severity and the urgency of the situation. And I'm afraid I already see the signs that in many different areas, people are starting to relativize the what has happened, to start talking about, well, yes, it's bad, but we can maybe just muddle through for the next 4 years. It's not going to be as bad as some people think. And that is precisely the wrong direction.
But Almut, you said earlier, politics is about, dealing with the situation as it is, not necessarily as you would like it to be. But here, when we look at the possibility of differentiated integration, of an avant-garde moving ahead because of the severity of the situation, we can no longer wait, for those of you who don't want to. Do you get a sense that that is part of the calculation that politicians are making? And if it isn't, what would you say to them about the consequences if they don't?
Just quickly on predictability or lack thereof. I think Trump in himself, the type of person he seems to be, the way he organizes relationships, that is the element that I see as unpredictable, and that is dangerous at times in a context where for EU leaders, it's always important to have carefully crafted documents and statements at 27, etc. This is a completely different style, that we have to embrace. On the question of moving ahead, my sense is really that Russia's war against Ukraine, that is felt in large parts of Europe. And I was just attending this morning a major foreign policy conference in the heart of Berlin, where 35 years ago the wall fell. And there should be really a very strong sense of urgency right now. I'm not sure, and we're getting to that, whether this is the main focus in Berlin these days. But my sense is that European security is something so existential. This is understood in a whole number of capitals. And this is why we felt the most urgent move needs to be made in terms of organizing European security, if need be, in a different constellation. And do I see political support for that right now? No. Do I want to abandon this concept? No. Our job is to help motivate and encourage leaders to look into these things again and revisit.
Very nice
old
way of putting
idea.
it. Encourage.
Well, that's
Yeah.
as think tanks. What can we hope for? We can hope for, as analysts, giving an interesting analysis of the situation, and our focus is the EU. And then we can hope for attention and political attention amongst those who care about a good future for the Union. And no doubt that has to be starting in the realm of security. It has a lot of dimensions here. And this is something I feel as Trump 2 gets into motion, and leaders sit around the table in the coming weeks and months, and the European Commission is starting off after the hearings. This is something that we can feel in meetings then on an everyday basis. The world is changing, and I feel we have a hunch here.
Okay.
By the way,
Janis, very briefly, if you would, because I want to move on to the competitiveness discussion. We have so much ground to cover today.
My second point will relate to the competitiveness discussion. The first point is, let's not exclude that some of the things which you promised to do in the US potentially might have certain successes or will be strongly interpreted as being successful. I'll give you one example: mass deportations. He was talking about 20 million people who need to be deported, that's the word he used, from the US. And what they want to achieve by this is to make clear that it doesn't make sense to knock on the border, on the US door at the Mexican border. So they want to stop people from coming. If they do this, even if they only partially do it, and they have a success from their perspective, not from my perspective, from their perspective, there will be people in Europe who will say, see, it works. So that's why I'm saying we need to make sure that we understand fully potentially what the implications are at the political level. Now, with respect to what should we do, I think actually what normatively we should do is we should have a different mindset. That if we have that consequence of Trump 2, which we have in front of us, with respect, for example, to tariffs, with respect to putting our economies even further under pressure, Draghi is telling us, and that's where competitiveness comes in, is what we, in his analysis of what the problem is. And by the way, when he describes the analysis, it's not the EU only, it's also what the problem is in certain individual member states, including, for example, in Germany. You need a totally different mindset to react effectively to it. It's not only about taking certain aspects which are easy to deliver upon, but you need to have a different mindset, which includes the need for European cooperation at a totally different level. Is that what we're able to do among the 27? I doubt that this is what we're able to do on the 27, and not only because of the Orbans, but the EU is a unifying machinery. It tries to get us all together and to unite in one position. And that's what it was made to do. And it's good for this purpose. But I'm just analytically saying that the likelihood of that happening is not very high. So if we want to have a different mindset to effectively address the problems we're having, which includes European cooperation, we need to have those on board who are able to promote that.
Point taken. Got to move on.
Yes, but we're already moving on, because look into what the discussion is in certain countries, and the German government partially also was not able to have that different mindset.
We'll come back. We will come back on that.
Yes, I know, but I'm just saying how these are linked with each other.
Fabian, competitiveness. And I'm wondering the extent to which, again, the debate, this was a summit, the Budapest Informal Summit was about competitiveness. That was the topic for the discussion. Is your sense that Trump's victory had a significant impact? And the most obvious area one could think of here is whether a Trump 2 will likely lead to a further weakening, the sense of a weakening of the commitment to the European Green Deal, given the potential impact of Trump withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, given the potential impact on competitiveness of other things he's threatening to do. What was your sense of how it influenced the debate, if at all?
Well, it certainly influenced the debate, but did it really lead to a recognition that we can't just simply continue the way we have done things up to now? I would argue no, it hasn't. And I think it continues to very much be along the lines of what we had already criticized before in our updates. That it's easy to pay lip service to certain concepts, to certain reports, to ideas, But when you actually come to doing what is necessary, then it becomes costly. And then suddenly these good ideas become much longer term. They drop off the agenda. And what we should have realized is that having Trump now will be even more of a threat to European competitiveness. We are going to have an international trading system which will barely function because Trump doesn't believe in free and fair trade. He believes essentially in a mercantilistic world where you maximize whatever you can take for your own state, and whatever you don't like, you try to use your political power, your economic power, to eliminate that. It's going to lead to trade wars. It's going to lead to a complete demise of the global multilateral system, including the World Trade Organization. So for Europe, the world has become even harder. Competitiveness will be even harder to achieve. So we should be talking about rather radical actions, which we're taking, but that's not what we're seeing.
So, but when you look at the Budapest Declaration on the new European Competitiveness Deal, as it calls it, it says business as usual is no longer an option and promises to make the union, quotes, more competitive, productive, innovative, sustainable, and indeed describes the Letta and Draghi reports as a solid foundation, I'm quoting still, to ambitiously advance our work. Just to follow up on what you just said, do you think in any sense they mean it, or is this just nice words? I mean, has this declaration, this meeting moved the dial in any sense? I'm getting a feeling from you, you don't think it has.
Europe, I think, has a competitive advantage in making lovely declarations. But I think the reality is that to achieve that kind of goal, that's really what the question is. How do we get there? Not what is it we want to get to. And to get there, it will be costly. And it also will have very many very difficult political discussions, which include, for example, a discussion around public money. Where is the money going to come from for the things which we're saying we're going to do? Because we're not going to get it from nowhere. We have to raise this somewhere. Does that mean, for example, European borrowing?
There is a reference to looking at innovative instruments.
Oh, of course, we will look at many things. Are we going to do them? And this is the ultimate question. Now, we have known all of this for a very, very long time. And it's rather frustrating that even when we are faced with such a radical environment in which we are now operating, we are still looking at, we're still investigating, we're still thinking about. And in part, this is also coming back to the discussion we just had about unity versus ambition. We know that not all member states are going to do certain things, but rather than some of them then going ahead and saying, well, we'll do it anyway, we're just continuing to postpone until the moment when it becomes really painful.
Thank you. And Janis, a reaction to that, but also, I mean, when you read the declaration, action in 12 key areas, is your sense reading it, here we have a clear set of strategic priorities, or yet again, it looks to me like a very long shopping list. They've thrown everything in. There's nothing I can think of they've left out. So there's no sense still of what the real priorities are. Am I being unduly cynical?
No, it is a very long list with 12 competitiveness drivers, as they call them. So you could call this a shopping list, a Christmas tree list, whatever you want. But if we would do everything that these 12 drivers say we should be doing, I think Europe's competitiveness would be in a better state. So the question is not what we have put down on paper, but actually whether and how we want to deliver. By the way, previous versions of the text were more detailed when it comes to what actually should be done. So even that text was narrowed down compared to the original one. But the point you asked in the beginning is this document says business as usual is no longer an option. And all leaders agree to that. But it is different consequences they draw out of this. Because some would say, the more radical ones on the one side of the divide, yes, business as usual is no longer an option, so we need to get rid of the EU, which we currently have. We need to create a different creature because this EU doesn't make sense in the times we live in, and actually we don't want it because ideologically we don't want it. These are the Orbans of this world. And all those also who are not in power and thus have not subscribed to the document, who would agree to it because they have a different notion in their head when it comes to Europe. But also on the other side, there are differences of opinion. And that's why I said earlier, the issue we were talking about when it comes to Germany and the collapse of the government, that had also to do with the question of debt and how you're going to finance certain things with respect to Germany's economy, which is severely under pressure. Just take this as an example. So there are differences also in the liberal or progressive or whatever camp you want to call it, who are more pro-European when it comes to how to react and how to deal with these things. So the question is not what you put down on paper, but what you're actually ready to do, what you're ready to invest in it, and how you do it. And I have my doubts that this is doable among the 27 to the level which is necessary.
Thank you. Almut, do you share the gloomy analysis of Fabian and Janis here? And I'm thinking, linking this to what you said earlier about security and how this is recognized and as an existential issue and how important it is. One of those priorities refers to defense readiness and capabilities, in particular strengthening our defense technological and industrial base, and talks about developing options for public and private financing. So in this area, if maybe not in the other 12, do you sense that the world we now live in, the geopolitical tensions, which have risen still further with Trump's election victory, on that they are waking up? I mean, do you share the sense this is just a very nice list, but doesn't move us on at all? Or in some areas, might it?
I think it's important that security and defense is in the report. It is also part of the guidelines and the political mission of Ursula von der Leyen and her newly appointed or designated defense commissioner, alongside with, of course, other key commissioners, executives in the commission. Very important move by von der Leyen to say we cannot conceive European defense without a single market dimension, and here we need to take steps further. Is this going to be easy? No. There is a lot of competition, of course, between member states, and here we will see how this battle evolves with the Commission on the one hand and the member state capitals on the other hand. And here this, I think, applies this logic to the wider questions of competitiveness. By the way, I'm really surprised that against the backdrop of what we've seen, this huge success, electoral success of Donald Trump in the US elections, that while I understand, of course, analytically that competitiveness is the key thing, that there is still a rather technical language evolving around that. So for me, this document, the European Council declaration is not the most relevant document against that background, because what we really need to do, and this will be on the minds of every single leader around this table, is to find a way to make sure that your electorate believes that you can deliver for your people to have a good life. And the promise that Donald Trump gave was more compelling to more people in the United States. And so in this language, the question then is, to what extent do we have EU leaders around the table who both analytically and politically feel that the union and union membership is the key part of this equation? Or where do they rather feel, well, in the short to medium term, can I come up with some ideas? Of course, the single market legislation is something that applies to everyone. But, in terms of a political assessment, everybody will be looking at his or her electorates at home. And to navigate that will be hugely complicated in the coming years. Technically speaking, of course, most relevant when legislation kicks off at EU level. This has to happen and has to happen fast. For now, we're not in this period yet. And this, for me, will be really the proof of, whether any of the political guidelines that have been put forward and that at board level also EU leaders have adopted will actually see the light of day.
Yes, it doesn't make bedtime reading for your average member of the public. That is certainly true. Janis, this is an issue, security and defence issue you have long urged greater sense of urgency, more action. We see reports today talking about the funding side of all this, that the Commission are going to suggest unlock cohesion policy funding for defence-related projects. Do you have a sense that in this area, even if not in the others, they are waking up?
No, I think that there is a waking up. The question is whether the waking up will lead to what actually needs to be done. And Almut is right. You also need to persuade your national electorates for what needs to be done, which means that those who need to do the persuasion on the pro-European side need to openly argue what we need to do is more cooperation at the European level, which also means that we need to put money into our hands. Now, what you were now referring to with respect to cohesion funding, to regional funding, is something which is positive. But the question is that enough? And what else is required to be done? Where you quickly come to the question of whether you need some form of joint common borrowing in order to finance jointly defense activities. And I'm questioning myself as to whether we have that readiness to invest the political capital into this, or whether we trust that the EU is able to deliver on this. Because there's also a trust issue. Now with Trump in power in Washington, or coming to power in Washington, there will be even more question as to whether can we trust our fellow European allies in the EU that they will be able to deliver, or are we not at the end of the day dependent on Washington, and thus we need to find a way to deal with the fact that he's in power and we need to accommodate. And if he asks us to do something which other member states do not want us to do, we might be ready to do so. So there will be this attempt from the US to divide us, and I fear that there will be divisions among us, which is exactly where then the question comes up: where will the energy come from, the leadership come from, to have a strong enough position to do what is needed in the area of defense and security?
Let's come back in a little while. We're going to talk about Germany in just a moment, to the question of whether the leadership might come from there post-election. But Fabian, you wanted to come in on this point before we move on.
Yeah, just to say, this is very clearly exactly what we have been talking about before, the progress illusion all over again. Yes, we are doing certain things. Yes, we're taking steps. But these steps are small steps when we compare them to the scale and the scope of the challenge. So we are just having the illusion of progress as long as we don't recognize that we have to go much further. And it's not impossible to do. I think, for example, we could have been much more concrete on competitiveness. We could have said, as we did with the 1992 single market program, by the end of 2025, we will have the legislation in place for the Capital Markets Union. Now, that would require all of the member states to commit to it, but then you would have a very clear program, a very clear timescale, a very clear achievable. So it is possible to do something like that. And I would argue exactly the same thing in the defense and security sector, that we know there are common procurement issues, etc. So we need to set concrete goals and concrete timescales and then move in that direction. Just saying that in principle it would be a nice thing to have is not going to produce any progress.
Yeah, but now it says we need decisive steps towards a savings and investment union by 2020 steps. Decisive steps.
We make
what does
very,
that mean?
very good declarations.
Yeah, and indeed, in the cases where a date is referred to, I was just quickly glancing at the declaration again. It's let's have some proposals by, as opposed to let's have some action on. So that lack of timetables, milestones, targets, also a glaring omission. Let us turn our attention now, after that somewhat gloomy assessment of where we are post-summit, to Germany. And Almut, you mentioned you're in Berlin. You were at this conference this morning, marking the fall of the Berlin Wall, the anniversary. Explain to us who are not permanent German watchers, what happened? Why has the government collapsed? And could it, I mean, it seemed extraordinary that it happened just as we were learning about Trump's resounding victory. Could it have been avoided at this incredibly crucial time for European and global politics?
This has been brewing for quite some time. Looking back, it started off almost exactly a year ago when the coalition government of the three parties, the traffic light, as it has come to know, put together a budget to handle the massive transition that Germany has to do, as every other single EU member state has to, and that is handling a security situation on the one hand and an absolutely vital transition into a post-fossil future, and came up with a budget. Then exactly a year ago, the Federal Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe declared anti-constitutional. And so there has been a budget quarrel going on for a long time now over the past months. It didn't come completely surprising. I belong to those who felt that the Chancellor was less likely to call for a vote of no confidence. He did that. He did that at a point in time when the world was watching elsewhere. Because the political timeline in Berlin to put the budget together and the requirements that has passing through the Bundestag and then all that is related to that meant that this happened to be the day. There have been a lot of high-level conversations in the weeks before, and it was brewing. It was brewing, and of course, there is also a link to the situation. Interestingly, if you look at the declaration of Chancellor Scholz, who then asked for a vote of no confidence after having dismissed his finance minister and kind of addressed him and singled him out in quite a personal way in his formal statement when he stepped out later in the evening to say, I dismissed the finance minister and I'm planning to hold a vote of no confidence in mid-January, which is perhaps ending in snap elections then, because the original schedule meant that elections were supposed to be happening in September next year. So this was a kind of a sequence of events that, of course, is also related to the US. And Chancellor Scholz even said it in the end of his speech, of his declaration. He said, of course, under the impression of the huge and deep divisions in the United States, we are all working towards this not to happen in our country. And yet, as we know and have come to understand over the past month with 3 important elections in 3 federal states in East Germany, but also if you look at the opinion polls, Germany is moving to the right, quite significantly to the extreme right. And so this is a political context against which this is all happening. It is rather, by some pointed out, this is a normal thing. Of course, governments change and sometimes they don't change in normal procedures, but it's also very dramatic because of the political environment that the German, overall Germany has been operating in over the past weeks.
And you talked about the time frame, but that has shifted. We now know that snap election, the vote of no confidence, I think December, snap election February. Then how long to form a government? I mean, are we in, as we often are in German politics, indeed in Belgian politics, for a very long period of uncertainty in the EU's biggest and most powerful member state?
Possibility. I think the sense of urgency is understood, yet political majorities will not be easy. And this is part of why I believe Chancellor Scholz believed in having a vote of no confidence only in January and not in mid-December now, to be able to get some key legislation through the German parliament, even with a minority government that he's now leading, because he felt there is a lot of key pieces of legislation, including budget-related issues on Ukraine, strengthening the German armed forces, also on questions of migration and security that have been negotiated also between the federal level and the federal states, to push that through, even with a minority government that then will hope and organize support from other parties in parliament, to be able to steal thunder in the next round of federal elections from the extreme fringes of the political spectrum. Now, obviously, he was pushed back, the opposition leader, Friedrich Merz, CDU, and also others, for understandable reasons, that we need to have a situation cleared earlier than that. So this is what you talk about is now the compromise that was found. But of course, I mean, a German government will have to be negotiated if there are majorities. I'm not certain at this point in time, if you're looking at the polls, that it will be easy to do that. And then there is always a start of a legislature. And, you know, we see that at EU level at this point in time. This will take some time.
Just one other quick factual question. Well, speculation, I think, but maybe you can help us, and then I'll give Fabian and Janis a chance to react to what all this means for the EU. I've seen a report today. We know it'll be, you just mentioned him, Friedrich Merz will be the candidate for the CDU. I saw a suggestion today that Olaf Scholz might not be the candidate for the SPD, and that the defense minister is a popular choice. Some people feeling Olaf Scholz has no chance of winning and therefore they need to replace him. How likely is that? Just briefly, if you would.
In the party at this point in time, of course, there is the assumption and the assessment, as it would be, that if you're running into an election campaign and the chancellor himself decides not to step back from that he will be the candidate. Right. Would I take this for an absolute granted? No, because a lot of things are in flux here as well. So a space to be watched.
Thank you very much. Fabian, just coming to you in terms of the consequences for Europe of such a prolonged period of political uncertainty in Germany, in the most powerful member state. And then Janis, perhaps to you in terms of what we might expect after the elections. What could this mean? Could we see better, stronger EU leadership from Germany than we've seen? Could the Franco-German relationship improve, or do you see downsides as well if the expected outcome indeed is what materializes? But Fabian, first, in terms of what this means for the EU right now.
I'm looking forward to Janis's optimistic take. I think it's important to emphasize that actually what we're seeing now is not just a short period of instability as is normally created by elections, but we're talking about structural uncertainty now, structural instability within the system. What Almut was already referring to, this the question of what kind of majorities are even possible. We might well be in minority government territory. And that would profoundly change also how Europe can look at Germany in terms of its leadership role. Essentially, the weaker the government gets, the less certain the direction is, the more difficult will it be to get controversial issues through. And more things at the European level are increasingly controversial. So what we, I think, are going to see is a continuation of government by crisis, that essentially you react only when you have the gun against your head, when you have no other choice. We are back to Angela Merkel with her, there is no alternative. Only at that point will you then get any action. And that is completely inadequate for a world where you have to think long-term, where you have to think strategically, where you have to also prepare the ground for many things. So I think it is going to be a significant weakness for the German system, and by extension, it is a significant weakness for Europe.
I'm just, Janis, I'll come to you now on what this might mean in the longer term and whether you could give us a positive gloss. But I'm also wanted to link this to something interesting. Donald Tusk is taking the initiative in organising a series of meetings to talk about the bloc's security policy. He's invited the French, the UK, the Baltic states, the Nordic states, hasn't invited Germany, and said he thought they had something else on their minds for the time being. But are we seeing anyway, we talk about traditionally Germany as the great leader of Europe, that's shifting as well. So German leadership or not, how crucial will it be as we face up to all the issues we've been talking about during Update today? And do you see any positive light in all of this?
First of all, Donald Tusk was not invited to Berlin when Biden came over.
So he's getting his own back.
So I'm just wanted to mention it. Now, I was asked to try to be more positive. First of all, no one of us is able to look into the crystal ball. And as already Almut indicated, it's extremely difficult to make a prediction at this point in time. I think that those parties who have been in this Ampelkoalition all hope that they will be able until election day to improve their position. Now they are all very weak. FDP around 5, the Greens about 10, 11, 12, SPD around 14, 15, 16, depending on which polls you look at. So together they are below what the numbers now show with respect to CDU-CSU, which is above 30. So they all have room to improve. And I would assume if you would now, off the record, speak to Scholz, he would tell you what he thinks, he would say, and he won't step down for Pistorius. He would say, I'll get a better result than many people think. And by the way, I know how to deal with Merz, and he's not the strongest of candidates. The SPD will do better than they are now in the polls. The same, the Greens would argue, and even the FDP for different reasons.
Okay, but just sorry, we need to be very brief.
So what I think what is the most likely to happen is that you will have potentially the numbers adding up to CDU, CSU, and SPD to either form a government or a very strong minority government. So that would be a grand coalition. Now you would argue, was that the best of things in the past? I would say compared to what we've had with the Ampelkoalition, with the three-party coalition thus far, in terms of the EU, unfortunately, that coalition did not was able to show strong European leadership. So this coalition government coming out next time, again, very much guessing, might be even better from a European perspective. And I think that that government, because a lot of people say during the Grand Coalition in Germany, things were not moving. I think that coalition government, even if you're in principle critical of it, I don't think that they will not understand that they have to get things moving and have to reform things. Yeah. So if you want me to be positive, I think there could be a positive scenario coming out of it. But again, it's very wild guessing.
Two other positive glosses people put on it point out that Merz is a former MEP, so has more interest in European affairs, and many people saying, well, could the Franco-German relationship get any worse? Anything's got to be better. I throw those into the mix, but we need to move on because in the last 7 or 8 minutes, I want to touch on two other points. Today is sort of, if you like, a big bang day in the commissioner designate hearings. We have all the executive vice president nominees having their hearings on one day. Interesting suggestion that this is a sort of mutual destruction clause. So if you want to take out one you don't like, then they will take out one we don't like. But I don't want to get into that sort of speculation game. But in terms of whether we have learned any more from these hearings so far about VDL2, anything that has surprised you? Can anybody help me in terms of your reading of where we are and indeed the caliber of the candidates? Is this going to be a strong commission or a potentially weak one? Fabian?
I think what we've seen is a continuation, what we already saw in the run-up with the nominations, that essentially Ursula von der Leyen has managed to exert a lot of control. Whether that will lead to effectiveness, I think what we are going to have is a rather weak commission with not many heavyweights, not many who can really also act independently. So it will all very much depend on the center. It will very much depend on what passes through that very narrow space at the center. So the risk of deadlocks, of delays, I think is rather high. But then in the end, this is a dysfunction by design rather than by accident.
Any other quick comments to that? Almut?
I've just arrived at the EPC. I have to be more positive. This is my first legislature.
This is your role.
I admire Ursula von der Leyen for, her executive vice president's decision. I have endless trust in these women pulling it off in just the style. They will cooperate with one another and also drag Monsieur Séjourné along. But this is not a very qualified assessment, I admit.
Thank you, Janis. I don't know whether you want to add anything. I have one last question, which I would like to address with you all. This was Charles Michel's last summit as the president of the European Council. And I want to ask, we've been critical of him in the past, Janis, as you look back over his full term in office, what is your assessment of that? Do you think that the incoming president, Antonio Costa, are there any lessons from him? And I suppose my third question would be, can a change of president really make a difference? Does it matter who is in that seat as we try to navigate these very turbulent waters we've been talking about throughout this update and for many, many months? Janis.
You posed a couple of questions here. Okay, well, let me come. He was the third president of the European Council since the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, and we've had three very different presidents. And if I compare all three with each other, they had different styles. They were confronted with different sorts of crises. They were all confronted with what we call the perma crisis, so with different chapters of that. And they dealt with it in different terms. So also, if you compare the predecessors, if you compare Herman van Rompuy and Donald Tusk with each other, they had different styles. There are different ways of doing it. But I think in some, and we have been discussing this in the past, and it's an open secret, and I'm putting it diplomatically, he was probably not the strongest of the three. And there are some lessons to be learned from that. And one lesson, I think, because you were asking about Antonio Costa, to be learned from that is, one, you clearly need the trust of EU leaders in the room, in the European Council. They need you to trust you. They might not always agree with you, but they must have the sense that you're trying to forge compromises, trying to find a consensus at the highest possible level, not at the lowest common denominator, and that you will do that behind the scenes, and that you will help those who have a certain position among leaders to get certain things through, in order to get that through if you believe that's the right thing to do. So you are more of a chair than you are a president of the European Council. You chair what they're doing and you try to move things forward. The second lesson I would take is that, and that's something Donald Tusk did not do in the beginning, only after 1-2 years in office, is that you also try to be vocal in terms of your positions. What you think should happen at the European level. You should indicate that you have a compass as what needs to be done, the direction you want to go. I remember some weeks ago we were together with Almut discussing about that a speech he gave in Berlin, in his very early days, Herman van Rompuy being president of the European Council, and he convinced those people sitting in the audience. And it does make a difference if people know what you're thinking, what your compass is, and which direction you want to go. This is something we never found out from Michel. So I would hope that Costa will, contrary to what Tusk did in the beginning, express himself, share his views, try to give some political intellectual guidance, and share what he thinks the direction is we need to go. And he will definitely have a difficult job.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so I don't know. Almut, would you like to add anything briefly?
To say that Costa is someone who is politically has a very good kind of navigation. Of course, as a socialist, this can also be helpful, but as a leader, he knows the local level, was the mayor of Lisbon for many years. He knows the national level. He's well respected in European capitals, well beyond Europe's south, and also regardless of political color. A more quiet person on the outset, it will be very important to be able to navigate an adversarial environment. And I don't think huge egos would be very helpful there. So let's see how that relationship evolves, including with Commission President von der Leyen.
Possibly
and
more in the style.
The third European in a sort of in the Brusselian context, Mark Rutte now at the helm of NATO. This relationship, of course, will also be absolutely vital.
So probably more a president in the style of Herman van Rompuy than of the other two we've seen. Fabian, a last thought from you.
Yeah, very briefly, you asked on a different issue. It can't get any worse, can it? And I think this is probably what I would apply here. He will not be missed. But I think that does not mean that the new leadership will deliver. And it will be crucial to bring the member states together with the Commission, also with NATO. And in the end, we have to appreciate that the job is much bigger and much more difficult now than it has been in the past. So the challenge is even greater.
I am sure we will come back on this in updates to come, but thank you all very much, and a particular thank you to Almut for joining us from Berlin today. It was great to have you back, Almut. That is all we have time for. Just a reminder, there is that commentary that Fabian, Janis and Almut wrote together on the EU's reaction to Trump and what it needs to do. There's also another one. We didn't really talk about NATO today. We didn't have time, but there is another commentary, Time for a New Deal between the EU and NATO. Take a look at that. Events in just under 30 minutes. The EPC talks geopolitics with the Ukrainian Parliamentary Commissioner for Human Rights. And tomorrow, a policy dialogue on the liberal world after the US elections. What next? We'll be back at the end of the month with another update and a date for your diaries as we approach Christmas. December 5th will be the EPC's annual conference, Leading Europe in the New Era. What skills and strategies do we need? I will have the privilege of moderating that conference. Very much looking forward to our discussions there and hope many of you will be able to join us. But we'll see you back here on Update at the end of November. Thank you all very much. Bye.